All right. So I'm just going to chat about manifestations and the changes that we got in the most recent FAQ and whether or not I think they'll be successful in sort of making them a little bit more fun to play with and against. And in my opinion, the changes that we got to manifestations in general aren't really that useful, but the changes that we got to the specific manifestations, I think, will help with the specific problems that we have. So the landscape from my perspective is that most manifestations, most of the laws, and many lists are totally fine. There's some abuse cases that are quite annoying. Morbid conjuration, obviously, a bit of a problem. And some of those wizards like Teclis, maybe Zinch with the really powerful casting bonuses and access to a lot of casts in their list, and maybe Nagash, although Nagash is so many points that he probably needs the support. Some of these experiences can be very frustrating to deal with, mostly because they're used with Morbid Conjuration. So, in my opinion, Morbid Conjuration is a really proud nail, and it creates this frustrating meta where you have to take wizards in your list not because you want to cast spells from your army, but because you just need the banishers to be able to deal with those specific things, which to me is a really frustrating sort of thing. I don't like building a lot of my list around uh, anticipating specific things that I hate playing against. I don't like, for example, including a bunch of anti-shooting stuff because I dislike the shooting armies that are in the meta. I like to build synergy and a list that sort of works together with each other and that covers all its bases and is protected against multiple angles, is very versatile and can face a lot of other lists. I don't like thinking, everyone is running Morbid Conjuration, it's such a headache to deal with. I'm going to take forecasts just so I have a lot of banishers open to me. So the big problem is, in list building, you can't just make a list where you have like one wizard and that wizard's going to cast a buff on some dude, and then you run a bunch of combat heroes or buff heroes that don't use magic to buff. Partially the problem here is the drops issue. Everyone wants to be low drops, and wizards take up drops, right? So these combat heroes are really hard to field at the moment. So there's like a cascade of issues that comes out of Morbid Conjuration being really powerful. But overall, if you look at the other spell laws, they don't seem that impactful. So we'll see if these changes fix up that problem about list building and that problem with like maybe Teclis with Morbid Conjuration, some of that NPE that you get with that, but then mostly still let you use manifestations and give them a place and a role, because I actually kind of like that they are at least useful now. All right. So first change, no more than one friendly wizard or priest can attempt to summon the same manifestation per turn with, we're replacing that text with a bit that says you cannot summon a friendly manifestation that was removed from play in the same turn. Okay, so the change here is if something got banished, you can't use magical intervention to summon it back straight away. And this is mostly relevant for ones that affect things in your opponent's turn straight away. So that's going to be like Soul Snare Shackles, or I think the one I get hit by a lot was the Rune of Petrification in LRL. Those types of things can be really annoying because if you don't banish them, then they're definitely going to hit you. So you want to get rid of them, but then your opponent often is able to summon them back straight away. And there's, it's just sort of dice rolling whether or not this happens to you, which is kind of frustrating, but also how other spells work, right? If I've got Be'lakor, I can cast Enfeeble Foe on you in my turn, but if I fail it and or you unbind it, then in your turn, I can also try to cast Enfeeble Foe on you again. Or I could cast like Neferata's thing that gives a unit of Blood Knights Ethereal. And then if I fail that in your turn, I could try it again, right? You're being able to cast the same spell twice in a battle round is kind of the problem here. Not so much being able to summon something that was banished immediately. It feels frustrating, it feels annoying, but it is sort of the same thing that is happening with other spells. You just don't notice it as much when it's not manifestations. So I don't love this change. It will be mostly when you think about things like Soul Snare Shackles and Rune of Petrification. What's happening is people will summon them on their own turn, and Rune of Petrification I think has an extra effect where it might make you strike last or something. But let's just stick with Soul Snare Shackles. That thing lowers your movement, and it's not really useful for your opponent to use it to lower your movement in their own turn. When they're casting it in their turn, they're doing it just to deal like some damage, which is a bit sad that like an endless spell is better than all your lore spells when it's only doing half of its effect. There's just a bit of an imbalance in like which spells you want to pick. Could I do Vile Transference, which is like range 18 and maybe does like 1 wound to a massive unit of Gut Rippers? Or I could cast Soul Snare Shackles and do 3d3 mortals, like an average of 4 or 5 wounds or something across my opponent's army, across 3 different units. It's just a much more efficient damage option, and I think that's a bit of a problem. It should maybe be more useful as the effect, and shouldn't be so much better than other spells. But this specific thing of getting rid of it and summoning it again, your opponent's just not going to summon Soul Snare Shackles in their own turn. They'll just wait for the magical intervention and use it then. It doesn't stop them summoning Shackles in your turn. It just stops them re-summoning Shackles. So you're still going to get hit by it, and you're still going to get hit by it in the same window. So I think the NPE that you get from something like Soul Snare Shackles actually really isn't addressed by this. What's addressed is your opponent won't summon it in their turn. They won't get that 3d3 damage. But in my opinion, Soul Snare Shackles is probably just a bit good for dealing damage, right? Maybe if it just did 1 damage or something like that instead of d3, it would make more sense just as a spell or as a war scroll. Then you've got a new bonus to banishing manifestations. So add the following to the declare step of banish manifestation. Add 1 to the banishment roll for each additional enemy manifestation on the battlefield after the first. So I think this is an attempt to address spam without hitting people who just want to summon 1 manifestation and leave it at that. Right? If you just summon, spell portal or something like that, and that's really all you're using your spells, your manifestations for, you don't get any bonuses to banish that spell. But if you summon all of Morbid Conjuration, you get +3 to banish. And we'll see with Gravetide went up in casting value, you get +3 to banish a casting value 8 spell. So it might actually be quite hard to cast Gravetide and quite easy to banish it. One thing about this change in particular is that it looks like it targets Morbid Conjuration because Morbid Conjuration has the most, like it can have 4, whereas other spell laws only have 3 spells in them. So you only ever get +2 with other spell laws, and you get +3 with Morbid Conjuration sometimes. But it's sort of one of them, doesn't really penalize Morbid Conjuration more, just because it's a greater penalty to not have 4 spells than it is to have +1 to unbind your 4th spell. So it still leaves Morbid Conjuration in a really good position. And for other spell laws, the problem I find with Morbid Conjuration is that they have 4 spells that do very similar things. All of them do decent damage and have like extra wounds. So you take Morbid Conjuration and you're just able to use magic to deal a lot of attrition to your opponent and to summon a lot of health into your army. Other spell laws, things like Twilight Sorcery, that has, I think, Geminids, which doesn't do much damage, mostly has a techie thing around stopping commands. Spell Portal, again, just a tech thing. And the Palisade, I think, is in Twilight Sorcery. And that thing is really, really hard to use. And again, a really specific tech piece. These, if you have all 3 of these out, it doesn't really build up the same way having 4 manifestations out in Morbid Conjuration does. If your opponent has 4 Morbid Conjuration manifestations out, they just have extra health and damage coming out of their army that's harder to deal with. If you have all of Twilight Sorcery out, then they've got 1 spell that casts further, and like you might have a bit of trouble shooting with 1 unit against 1 unit, and like maybe 1 or 2 of your units can't use commands. It doesn't stack up in the same way. So it doesn't need the same penalty. You don't need that +2 to banish things from Twilight Sorcery. So I feel like some of the other manifestation laws are just catching a stray here. The real problem is Morbid Conjuration, and this doesn't actually help you with that spell spam quite as much. One thing that will happen here is if you have 4 manifestations out, if you've summoned, you took Teclis and you summoned all 4 of your manifestations, you can pick the one that's least convenient for you, and you have a very strong chance of banishing that. So there is some advantage in the fact that when you give up one of your casts, you're going to have to you're going to have a very, very high chance of getting the most inconvenient manifestation gone. So it is something. It's just, I don't think it really hits the specific problems that I think exist. And that's it. I thought there was one more change, but I guess the rest are all just specific changes to specific manifestations. So these two changes together, in my mind, are not particularly helpful for fixing any of the issues that we have with manifestations. And the biggest thing is that list building thing. You really want to take many casters just so you can banish all your opponent's manifestations. And this bonus to banishing manifestations, well, it doesn't give you any additional banishes. Right? You still have to buy the 4 wizards or whatever, the 4 casts, 4 power level of wizards, so that you can get rid of everything that your opponent is summoning. And so if you're in a situation like, for example, I play Slaves to Darkness. I don't own Be'lakor, and I don't really want to go out and buy one. I feel like Be'lakor is often a bit NPE and stuff like that. He's obviously a really good unit, but I don't want to run Be'lakor. And so I'd prefer to run a list that has like a Demon Prince, uses my Chaos Lord on Karkadrak. I love both of those models. I think they're great. And then I've got a Chaos Sorcerer Lord. I really like him. So the kind of list I want is those 2 combat heroes, and then the Sorcerer Lord to give me like demonic speed, and I think he's got gives you a unit to a ward, right, which is not a spell. So I have 1 cast. That's my preferred my preferred Slaves to Darkness list is a 1 cast list. Well, when I come up against Teclis, I don't have many units in my army. I'm playing Slaves to Darkness. It's not a big spam army. You don't have units absolutely everywhere when you play Slaves to Darkness. I also don't have a ton of casts. So Teclis is able to summon a lot of these spells every turn, and I have to give up my demonic speed, the 1 spell, the whole reason I took this wizard. I have to give that up every turn to banish one of those manifestations that I know he can resummon every single turn. These 2 changes don't really fix any of the NPE or any of the frustration about playing against that endless spell list with the list that I want to run. And they don't allow me to run that list, which I think is the whole problem, right? I want to run a list that has non-wizard heroes in it because I like some of the non-wizard heroes. And I still feel like I've got a lot of pressure that I have to bring a bunch of wizards, because if my opponent spams manifestations, well, now it's even more important that I have banishers available to me so that I can access this sort of thing, right? So I'm not a big fan of these 2 changes. But we'll have a look at the specific changes because I think these ones are a lot better. So Morbid Conjuration, increasing the casting value of Suffocating Gravetide to 8. Fantastic. Gravetide is really, really good. Does a lot of damage. Does probably too much damage. Moves really far. Its movement ability is handy. It can get out of combat with it. The combined change of making it easier to banish and harder to cast. So if your opponent does summon all of Morbid Conjuration, you will get +3 to banish Suffocating Gravetide, and you still only banish it. I think it's still a 7-up. That doesn't go up when the casting value goes up. So it's easy to banish, but hard to cast. Again, doesn't address Teclis, and probably those like Tzeentch lists and things like Nagash or whatever. They're still going to have an easy time summoning it, but it does help you a little bit, even if you're not helped in the economy of the number of banishes you have versus the number of casts. The Maelstrom requiring you to detonate it, I think, is what this changes. You must and can only use this ability if this unit has 6 Maelstrom points. Pick each friendly unit. Pick each unit, friendly and enemy, within 9 of it to be the targets. So forcing you to detonate it means it's a lot riskier to just set it up in the first place. You really want to set it up and sort of walk away from it. Your opponent has so much more control. They don't have to use the banishes to get rid of it necessarily. They can sort of force it to detonate while there's nothing standing near it, either by putting some casualties next to it, and then like as you take the casualties, you get out of range of it, and then it'll go off at the end of the turn and sort of hit nothing, or just getting out of the way of it when you know it's charged up. That's really helpful for helping that economy. You don't have to take as many wizards to deal with your opponent's endless spells because you've got other options in dealing with them. And then you've got a change to Purple Sun. It got rid of the Wild Form ability. This is the thing that let it take 6 damage instead of just being banished. So Purple Sun was a bit of a 2-for-1, and in the previous edition, you could this would have been a really good idea. In the previous edition, the big problem with endless spells was you had to cast them, your opponent had a chance to unbind them, and then immediately they could start banishing them in your turn as well. So they had a chance, they had lots of chances because they could banish in the opponent's turn. They had lots of chances to make sure your endless spell never did anything. And because they could banish in your turn, that by giving up an unbind is much smaller of a cost than giving up a cast. So a lot of the time, your opponent they'll roll under their casting value for their spells, so you don't need the unbind to unbind every single one of their spells. They'll just mess some of them up on their own. So you can spend an unbind on getting rid of an endless spell, right? But with the new edition, now you can't banish in your opponent's turn. Now we don't need this extra level of protection. We don't need this layer of protection so that you can cast it and it can survive 2 banishes. That's what you needed in the previous edition, where it was very cheap to banish things. Now it's quite expensive to banish things, and they added this ability, just meaning that Purple Sun was a 2-for-1 for the caster. It's a bit like a cantrip in Magic. You cast a spell and you just get to draw a card as well, sort of tacked onto it. So I really like this change. It just improves that economy of dealing with them. Now, if you banish the Purple Sun, it actually goes away. You don't have to double banish it. You don't have to run an extra wizard just to deal with it, sort of thing. Same thing from Rabbit Gnashing Jaws. That spell lore is less of a problem because it only had 3 things in it, and because one of them just heals you. So it's really only 2 spells. Ravenex is quite good. I think the other one does a very small amount of damage. It's not one of those overpowering spells. So from my opinion, like the nerfs specifically to Morbid Conjuration, this set of things, removing Wild Form, forcing the detonation, increasing the cast cost of Suffocating Gravetide, those are all the better changes that we're seeing. The other ones that penalize manifestations, they're going to hit other spell laws manifestations quite a bit more. I think for things like Rune of Petrification, I don't mind that you can't summon something that you just banished, because then it at least gives you some sort of window to not deal with it. But again, if it's a non-manifestation spell, then you just don't have that option anyway, right? If your opponent's going to cast a debuff spell on you that's not a manifestation, they can just always cast it in their turn and cast it in your turn, and you don't have this chance to like avoid being hit by it the same way that this new rule works for manifestations. I feel like that change actually doesn't make any sense. So this helps me a little bit. It means that I don't need quite so many casts to be able to deal with somebody who's summoning a lot of spells through Morbid Conjuration. Mostly the Wild Form thing here and the Maelstrom thing just means that, well, I suppose all of them, right? They might fail their Gravetide a bit more often, so my wizard doesn't need to banish that Gravetide now because they just failed to cast it. The Maelstrom change means I might be able to detonate their Maelstrom without wasting a banish on it. Purple Sun change means that it only cost me 1 banish instead of 2. So altogether, these are the better changes. These will allow me to run fewer wizards in my list, whereas the other manifestation changes, not so much. All right. I think that's about all I have to say. I haven't played games with these new rules yet. I think they're okay. Would have preferred to see something other than like bonuses to banish based on the number of spells they have. But yeah, really, really happy about what we got in terms of specific nerfs just to Morbid Conjuration, because the other spell laws really like try and use those endless spells. They are not fantastic. Pretty much all the other ones are mid at best, with maybe Ravenex being a little good. So quite happy about it. Anyway, I'll leave it there for this one, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one.